Computer Programming for Kids. Step 20, retrofitting and repurposing or refactoring our code. Continued. More. Now, rub your hands together in glee and anticipation of what we will accomplish today, or at least to get the blood flowing a bit. Get your coding fingers all ready. We left off in step 19, implying at least that we would discuss why it is that I feel that the code to calculate the percentage is interesting. To remind you of that code, it calculates the percentage like so. And then in the newsletter, you would see the 2 lines of code that do that. Do you notice something odd about this? The count of correct answers stored in the correct answers integer variable is divided by the count of questions so far answered, stored in the questions answered int variable. That makes sense, right? The first thing that might be confusing, which makes it interesting, is that it is then multiplied by 100. Why? Because 1 is the largest the result of that division will be. For example, 10 divided by 10 is 1, and that's as good as it gets. But we don't want to show 1% correct because that's not correct. Thus, we multiply it by 100 to get the value we would expect to see in that case. The second head-scratcher is the convert dot to double jazz. Why is that done? Because otherwise the value was rounded either up to 1 or down to 0 before being multiplied. Because dealing with integers, that's all that are available. Anything under half is rounded down to 0, and anything exactly at half or more is rounded up to 100. So when a person gets 4 answers right out of 7, which equates to around 57%, using integers, it says the value is 100%. If 3 out of 7 are answered correctly using integers, it would say 0%. Crazy, right? That's why real numbers are used by converting the ints into doubles. The real numbers, such as double, are more precise in that way. The text property of label percentage is then assigned the percentage value with the percent sign appended, and then it shows the line of code doing that. So that the update percentage correct code above actually does something besides plopping down in the midst of the code file and looking impressive. Add a call to it, and the next buttons click event handler. And then it shows that entire event handler when the next button is clicked. What's going on there? Actually, it doesn't show all of it. It shows the first part of it, what we need to talk about here. The code is the same for all of the questions until we reach the last one. It has to be handled a little bit differently. When the last question and set of candidate answers is populated onto the form, set the bool, that is the Boolean variable, freeze answer to true in the load next batch method. And then it shows that happening. The first part of that load next batch method. That's what's happening here above. It doesn't say literally or directly freeze answer equals true, but that's what the code above amounts to when the last question is reached. The effect is the same as or resolves to freeze answer equals true then. And prior to that, freeze answer is always being set to false on that line. Now, so that the value of freeze answer has some effect on what happens, add this to the radio button's check changed event handler. And then it shows the code that causes that variable's value to cause a change in the flow of the code. What's happening here is that the result of the if statement makes all the difference, like the road not taken. And then it shows an image of Robert Frost, who wrote the famous poem, The Road Not Taken. In this case, freeze answer equating to true, causing the 4 lines within the if block to run, is not a road not taken, but it is a road only relatively seldom taken, once per question answering session. Another housekeeping chore. Add 2 lines of code to the form load event so that it looks like this. And then it shows 2 lines of code that are storing the values and a couple of labels for later use. And yet another thing, let me show you the code for the combo box's drop-down event. This occurs when the user selects the drop-down arrow on the right side of the combo box. It populates the combo box if it has not yet been populated. This is called just-in-time coding. We don't populate the combo box until it needs to be populated. Then, once it's done, and any future drop-down event would just basically be ignored by checking to see if any items, already exist in the combo box. Here's how it looks, and then that code is shown. So let's go through what's happening here line by line. The first line is shown. If there are already items in the combo box, we just exit. C# calls it return from the method, so that none of the code that follows in that method is run. Although there is no else block literally added, like so, and then it would show that taking place, the effect is the same as if there was. The reason for this is the call to return in the if block. If that runs, then the second line of code does not run, just as if it were an else block. If the equation in the if block is not true, that is to say the number of questions answered plus 1 is not the same as the total number of questions, then return is not called and the code continues to run on the next line. So whether you put the else block in doesn't really matter. The same thing happens either way. Which way should you write it then? If you're interested in having your code be as concise as possible, leave out the explicit else code. On the other hand, if an else block helps you to understand the code better, by all means put it in. It won't hurt anything. Note, whether you add the else block or not won't cause your code to run any faster or slower, not even a teensy-weensy little bit. Why? The compiler will optimize the code before it's run anyway, and turn your code into something it understands and is more efficient for its purposes. But it looks like gobbledygook to all but the nerdishest and geekiest of programmers. For example, the entire code in that event handler will be turned into something that looks kind of like this. 110011 botellas de cerveza en devant. In other words, you can pretty much leave the optimizing of your code to the compiler. But we'll talk more about what we can do, good and bad practices, coding-wise, in a future step. Next line of code, and it shows another line of code. This sets up where we will look for the CSV files. You can change it if you want to store your CSV files in a different folder. Another line of code. This declares a string array in which to store the names of the CSV files. Next line of code. Any and all files found in the directory assigned to the path to search variable are assigned to the file name string array. The getFileNames method retrieves the names of files in the path stored in the path to search variable and stores those file names in the file names string array. Notice that it only selects files with a CSV extension, and then it shows a bunch of code, the entire method getFileNames, what it does. It's only 3 lines actually. In the getFileNames method above, a local string array underscore filenames is declared. The native method getFiles is called to retrieve files from path to search, which have the extension CSV. Note, native, in this sense anyway, means that the method comes with C#. We didn't have to write it ourselves. It's part of the C# language, or at least part of the code that supports C# that Microsoft provides in Visual Studio. Going back to the combo box's drop-down event handler, each of the file names retrieved is added to the combo box in the for each part of the code. And that part is shown again. If you're beginning to feel a little lost with all this code being thrown at you, don't worry. In the next step, I will post all the code for the project, just in case you missed some of it along the way, unless you would like to do that right now, would you? And then it shows a picture of Herman Melville, the author of not only Moby Dick, but also a short story called Bartleby, whose principal character, Bartleby was known for saying, "I prefer not to." All right, then, I will let you off the hook for now, and we'll leave that until next time. Besides, we have accomplished enough for this step. After providing all the code next time, we will thereafter continue by stepping through that code to see exactly what sequence it follows and what logic is taking place as we go along. In fact, there is a bit of a bug we need to fix, and the way for us to discover why something is going awry will be discovered by stepping through it and examining the state of things and the value of variables at various points along the way. Until then, earth-shakingly important notice. If you have a basic programming question suitable to an audience of kids, send it to idiolectable@gmail.com, specifying whether you would like your name and location used if it is printed in a future step of this newsletter. If you are a subscriber to the newsletter, you can also leave a question at the bottom of this step in the comments section. If you do not want to give your real name, a nickname is acceptable. The first letter to the editor of mine that was printed appeared in Rolling Stone magazine back in the early 1970s, and I signed it Sylvester, for some reason which I no longer remember. Finally, it's always interesting to see where people are from, so please provide your city or town and the state it's in too, or province, or whatever the region where you live is called.